My name is Amy Bloch, and as Daniel said earlier this morning, I'm one of the co-organizers of today's symposium, and I'd like to welcome you to the first afternoon session, whose subject will be bodies and space. As we all know, and as is clearly demonstrated in the exhibition upstairs, 15th-century sculptors dedicated a considerable amount of attention to the problem of representing the body or bodies within a spatial context, whether that space is fictive or is real. Early 15th century Florence can in fact be considered something of an experimental laboratory for the representation of the body and space and the body in space, and nowhere was the investigation more intense and focused and varied than at the cathedral and baptistry, so it is appropriate that we dedicate a session to this theme today. The second speaker in this session is David J. Drogin, who is Associate Professor of Art History and Department Chairperson at the State University of New York Fashion Institute of Technology, where he has been teaching since 2004. He received his PhD in 2003 from Harvard with a dissertation on 15th century patronage in Bologna, and his work is wonderfully wide-ranging. His published and forthcoming articles focus on, among many topics, Donatello's use of perspective, which I think he'll be speaking about some today, Bentivoglio patronage in Bologna, and Venetian tomb sculpture. I should also like to mention that he co-edited a splendid volume published by Ashgate on sculpture and patronage in the Italian Renaissance, to which I think some people here today contributed. Let there be light. Today he will be speaking on the body, space, and narrative in early 15th century Tuscan sculpture. Professor Drogin.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone involved for inviting me to be part of such a special occasion and interesting discussion. Few were more engaged with the artistic transitions of the early Quattrocento than Tuscan sculptors. In the century's first decades, before emerging Renaissance standards were codified, these artists developed and came to terms with innovations such as perspectival constructions, the illusionistic integration of figure and space, and engagement with the beholder. Attuned to this liminal context, this paper addresses approaches to bodies and narratives in space as represented or implied. My focus is Donatello, with comparison to Jacopo della Quercia, and briefly at the end, Ghiberti. The freestanding figure is my point of departure, but I focus on reliefs illustrating how these sculptors represented changing conceptions of space as tangible form, affecting subject, viewer, and narrative. I am particularly interested in how they employed spatial representation as a narrative as well as compositional tool. Donatello, for instance, capitalized on space and perspective's narrative potential, such that they are at times inseparable from the story and its protagonists, viewer included. Or with Jacopo, spatial representation was often at odds with figural and narrative priorities. And Ghiberti, so self-aware of his professional identity, deftly navigated a changing course. From the start of Donatello's career and work at the Duomo, as this exhibition illustrates, figure and space were inseparable. We're likely most familiar with St. John the Evangelist for the Duomo facade, circa 1410, and Donatello's optical corrections accounting for the spatial relationship of object and viewer. My focus, though, is on narrative, or at least its suggestion, for which we can start with Zuccone, finished by the mid-1430s for the Campanile and possibly representing the prophet Habakkuk. Although without a specific narrative, Donatello nonetheless suggests one, engaging the prophet with the world as he pulls the viewer into a psychological dialogue. If it is indeed Habakkuk, his turning with anguished expression to the viewer gives life to the crises of doubt that open the book of Habakkuk, where he speaks of God's violence and asks, "Yahweh, how long will I cry and you will not hear?" More than expressing puzzlement, he, whoever he is, transitively looks beyond the niche for help assuaging questions of faith. This engages viewers, providing a sense of companionship in their own spiritual doubts, so that they, like Habakkuk, can conclude, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, the sovereign Lord is my strength." With Abraham and Isaac, made with Nanni di Bartolo, known as Il Rosso, in 1421, also for the Campanile, we can speak of narrative exceeding material form and unfolding in space. Donatello and Rosso represented Abraham looking out at the implied angel in perplexed wonder as his grip on the knife loosens. The sculptors placed the crux of the drama between Abraham and the angel. The scene thus parallels Brunelleschi's relief for the 1401 baptistry door competition, where the dramatic crisis is between Abraham and the divine, rather than Ghiberti's version, emphasizing tension between father and son. But Donatello's action unfolds in real space, and the dialogue between man and the divine overflows above the viewer's own heads. This is, of course, similar to Donatello's earlier St. George looking out at a dragon, but with Abraham, the missing protagonist is an angel. So Donatello's narrative thrusts the divine into the world of the beholder. The fusion of object, narrative, and space creates compelling drama, but also suggests the presence of the sacred in our midst, and like Zuccone, emphasizes a drama unfolding between mankind and his God. Interestingly, when Ghiberti later made the sacrifice for the gates of paradise, he shifted Abraham's orientation toward the angel's intervention, thus joining Brunelleschi and Donatello in their conceptions of the narrative. Donatello's greatest experiments with spatial representations signifying potential were in relief, where he called on perspective in different ways. One approach was a literal or declarative mode, where perspective corresponds to narrative action, beyond accounting for the beholder's angle of vision. This is exemplified by the Ascension, with Christ giving the keys to St. Peter from the late 1420s, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit blown out at the top. Representing the scene with a worm's eye view, Donatello compels the viewer to look up at the ascending Christ from a low viewpoint, so that the foreshortened figures emphasize vertical perspective and movement through the pyramidal composition towards Christ rising at the top. Soon after, in the 1430s or early 40s relief of the Assumption of John the Evangelist in the Old Sacristy, Donatello's method was even more pronounced. As many have recognized, Donatello constructed the scene conforming to the viewer's position, looking steeply up at the relief in the pendentive, around a worm's eye perspective so low that the orthogonals are unusually the vertical lines that converge above the relief and thus emphasize the evangelist's ascent. The beholder's head cranes upwards, like those of the depicted bystanders, linking reality and representation redolent of the strategy seen in Abraham and Isaac. In short, in both reliefs, perspective underscores vertical heavenly movement. There is consensus on this interpretation, but what I want to emphasize is that Donatello's strategy here is literal. Perspective functions in a descriptive, declarative, or denotative mode. The protagonists rise vertically, and orthogonals and foreshortening correspond to that movement. The Siena Feast of Herod, completed by 1427, marks a different approach in which Donatello worked in a connotative mode, wherein the perspectival system and its effects touch on deeper narrative themes of violence and subjectivity. In this relief, orthogonals recede toward two clusters rather than a single point, as you see in the diagram on the left. This divides the composition, as does the foreground wall's bold horizontal. There, two cavities' awkward recession twists towards yet other vanishing points. With these spatial effects, Donatello created an uneasy recession and a skewed architecture that augment a beheading's violent narrative, inasmuch as it articulates protagonist's distress and the viewer's intended reaction. As John Paoletti wrote, the perspectival arrangement is not one of focus, typically perspective's goal, but of disruption, and creates an appropriately unsettling air of disharmony. Some attribute Donatello's spatial anomalies to oversight or clumsy perspectival construction, but this discredits an artist who, as we acknowledge elsewhere, carefully coupled form and content, space, figure, and narrative. Donatello's narrative-driven manipulation of spatial representation is most pronounced in the Miracle of St. Anthony reliefs for the high altar of Sant'Antonio in Padua, the Santo, from 1447 to 49. The two reliefs on the front were probably the Miracle of the Miser's Heart, when, as Anthony predicted, a dead miser's heart is found in his money chest rather than in his eviscerated body on top, and the Miracle of the Wrathful Son, where Anthony reattaches a foot a boy had cut off in penitence for kicking his mother. On the back were the Miracle of the Speaking Babe on top, in which a newborn speaks to identify his father, and the Miracle of the Kneeling Ass, where St. Anthony offers the host to the miraculously genuflecting animal. These last two reliefs present motifs of reaffirmed faith and virtue, and the shallow, balanced, rational perspectival settings echo the narrative's positive themes. In contrast, the wrathful son in Miser's heart foreground violence, trauma, and the disruption through dismemberment of codified norms of the family and proper death. And here, because of Donatello's spatial and perspectival representation, distorted space and fractured architecture resonate with themes of dismembered, violated bodies and social norms. In the Miser's heart, for instance, perspectival architectural space is irrationally incoherent, particularly in the left foreground structure, this structure here, and on the right, where architecture and spatial planes intersect in interpenetrating vertiginous structures that defy logic, especially in this section here. In The Wrathful Son, the confounding perspectival space is equally disruptive, as Donatello embraced distortions inherent in wide compositions, even enhancing them with a plunging depth. He represented as parallel, transversal, and orthogonal lines that would be perpendicular in reality. For instance, the facade of this building running into the background and the banisters parallel to the picture surface. Or lines meet at awkward, indistinct angles that appear to slope both down and back, and ungainly torsions on the right with a second vanishing point torque that side in a disorienting twist. This approach is in contrast to the balanced perspectival harmonies of the other two reliefs. For instance, in the kneeling ass on top, although waves of dramatic figures sweep through the space, the regularity of the architecture and the shallow perspective, which diminishes lateral distortion, balance and subdue that energy, as befitting the positive theme. In the opposite reliefs, here again the irascible son, a binary contrast articulates the opposite approach. Violated representational norms point to the violated norms of the stories, and the fractured, disjointed spaces and structures echo these narratives' fractured, dismembered bodies. But Donatello also engaged deeper with core themes of linear perspective itself. Art historians have long recognized that Renaissance perspective articulated a triumphant struggle for control. It was a normalizing technology and extended what Panofsky called the domain of the self. Medieval and Renaissance laws of geometry and optics were understood as manifestations of order and truth, setting the stage for linear perspective and its organizational drive. Samuel Edgerton has written of this context in which perspective was invented, citing Leonardo Bruni, writing in 1404, that, quote, "Nothing in this state is ill-proportioned, nothing improper, nothing incongruous, nothing left vague. Everything occupies its proper place, which is not only clearly defined, but also in the right relation to all others." This view of Florence and the world catalyzed perspective's invention and articulates its organizational drive, and is exactly what Donatello disrupted in examples like the irascible son. And Hubert Damisch argued that Renaissance perspective was a structuring paradigm that traps viewing and artistic experience, just as the individual is beholden to the structures of language, like a grammar system, that shape subjectivity. So what about Donatello's narratively driven subversion of perspectival codes in the violent reliefs? The viewer is shown the futility of reason in the face of corporeal and social violation. The fiction of the cohesive subject reaffirmed by linear perspective in a scene like the kneeling ass is torn asunder, like the gruesome narrative's physical bodies and norms in the violent scenes. Damisch asked, do the rules of perspective lend themselves to the representation of phenomena that break through the ordinary bounds of the human order? Donatello's violent reliefs suggest the answer is no. If this discussion seems distant from Zuccone and Abraham and Isaac, recall the central issue linking Donatello's reliefs and freestanding figures. He articulated narrative's core themes in relation to the viewer by visually and conceptually joining figures and contextual space. The Virgin and Child on the Santo altar continue this tactic with freestanding sculpture while he experimented with perspective's potential in the reliefs below. The Virgin rises from her throne at the viewer's approach. Her action is contingent on the viewer's advance through the basilica. So, as with our first examples on the Campanile, Donatello strengthened devotional potential by making the sculpture act with the beholder in and across space, fusing the divine and the real, bringing the sacred into our realm. Donatello's contemporary, the Sienese sculptor Jacopo della Quercia, also created meaning by sculpting figures that interact with surrounding space, but typically without the exigency of the viewer and to different spiritual effect. His sculptures for the main portal of San Petronio Bologna, begun in 1425 and carried out until his death in the late 1430s, are indicative examples. In the Virgin and Child in the Lunette, Christ scrambles energetically to the left, reaching across space toward St. Ambrose on the left. But that figure was carved by Domenico da Varignana in the early 1500s. Jacopo's original 1425 contract called for sculptures here, of Pope Martin V presenting Bologna's papal legate, party to the commission. The Virgin and Child were completed in an early stage with those figures in mind, before a renegotiated contract of 1429 eliminated the planned Pope and legate, following tensions between Bologna and the papacy. We must therefore read the Christ Child's actions stretching across the lunette space as a largely political gesture, linking Bologna's papal sovereigns to divine authority. The viewer is excluded from this circuit. The interaction of figure with contextual space is thus quite different from Donatello's examples on the Campanile or Padua altar. Jacopo's figures engage with contextual space, but offer the viewer no spiritual dialogue nor suggest tangible divine presence, as political gesture trumped devotional themes. The Old and New Testament reliefs on the pilasters and lintel offer greater contrast with Donatello. In these reliefs, as throughout Jacopo's later work, the artist prioritized the physicality of the human form. The bold bodies and simplified visual field pragmatically aid legibility, but Jacopo went beyond practicality in reliefs such as the Expulsion, or Noah leaving the Ark. In these examples, narrative is exclusively dependent on the body, its gestures, its expressions. Jacopo subordinated everything, particularly spatial representation, to human form, whose bulk annihilates landscape and architecture. Note the obliteration of space and structure in the Noah scene, or how the body's physicality threatens the structural integrity of the gate and in the frame in the Expulsion. As in Donatello's examples, narrative drives this approach to the body and space. In the Expulsion, Adam and Eve's physical being is at the heart of their fall and its aftermath, and in the Noah scene, the smothering overcrowding relates well to the 370-day confinement of man and beast. Yet we see this antipathy towards space and perspective even when not mandated by narrative content, as in the lintel's Adoration of the Magi on top, or Jacopo's contemporary classroom reliefs from the Bolognese professor tomb of Anton Galeazzo Bentivoglio. Thus, Jacopo's negation of space and perspectival systems seems rhetorical, given Donatello and contemporaries' approaches. Some have argued that Jacopo was, quote, disinterested in linear perspective, not part of the Florentine clique surrounding Brunelleschi and its invention circa 1410. But rather than passive disinterest, Jacopo seems engaged in willful antagonism with the increasingly standard representational device, rhetorically brandishing the human body as the definitive narrative tool. With this in mind, consider Jacopo's Annunciation to Zacharias in the Siena Baptistry font completed by 1430. Here the figures do not dominate the space, as in the previous examples, but share it with an architectural setting whose brick arcades indicate attempted cohesion with Donatello's adjacent Feast of Herod and Ghiberti's Baptist before Herod, completed 3 years earlier. Perhaps here we see Jacopo's hand being forced. Obliged by context to integrate figure and space, he used the architecture as stage, as if begrudgingly including it in the visual field. Contrary to Donatello's priority in these years, there is little effort to conceive of the body in space or an architectural setting, or to use these or perspective as narrative devices. This would have run counter to Jacopo's artistic practice. A final brief comparison to Ghiberti emphasizes that as new practices of perspective, illusionistic settings, and engagement with space and viewer became common, leading early Quattrocento sculptors navigated streams of tradition and innovation with a range unavailable to post-Albertian successors. Ghiberti's reliefs suggest that, perhaps driven by the professional self-awareness evident in his commentari, he was particularly intent at engaging with and shaping changing representational standards, from late Gothic priorities at the dawn of the century to emerging paradigms of Renaissance practice by the 1420s and 30s. Shifting strategies are evident even in his 2 reliefs for the Siena Baptistry font completed by 1427. The Baptist before Herod, on the left, likely made first, has parallels to Jacopo's relief. The setting is disengaged backdrop, and perspectival estimations, as in the ceiling, seem simply that rather than serve any narrative purpose. In Ghiberti's second relief, the Baptism, he seems more Donatello's peer. with transitions from high to low relief and foreground to background that fuse figures and illusionistic setting, as in later reliefs from his first set of baptistry doors, such as Christ Before Pilate or the Flagellation, on the bottom of which there is a replica in this exhibition. The spatial harmonies and figure-setting integration of the baptism appear throughout the Gates of Paradise, which Ghiberti began around the same time he completed the Siena reliefs in the mid to late 20s. In the Gates, though, Ghiberti did use perspective as a narrative tool, moving beyond visual integration to a semantic one, too. One example, discussed thoroughly by Amy Bloch, is the Jacob and Esau panel from the early to mid-1430s. As Bloch discusses, Ghiberti created and distorted his own perspective system to enhance the narrative. He used multiple vanishing points, widened orthogonals, and slowed transversal recession, especially in the center, to accommodate 7 episodes, and aligned figures with the beholder's changing viewpoint to integrate into the narrative protagonists' thoughts, memories, and visions. In short, Ghiberti manipulated the perspectival system in service to content, as Donatello was doing in the same years. Their approaches are distinct in that Ghiberti used perspective to structure narrative, whereas in Siena and Padua, Donatello imbued perspective itself with narrative meaning. But the sculptors shared a strategy of manipulating space and figure as equal representational components in service to the subject. This contrasts with Jacopo's negation of, or even antagonism to space as a storytelling tool. I do not suggest that only these sculptors grappled with the implications of the figure and in space, nor even that it was only sculptors and not painters who engaged with these issues, as Masaccio, Cello, Piero, and Mantegna disprove. My focus today was driven by the parameters of this exhibition and symposium, but also by the belief that these artists, and especially Donatello, did stand apart from their contemporaries as they came to terms with and pushed the boundaries of narrative possibilities enabled by the techniques that they themselves pioneered. The first decades of the Quattrocento marked a period of artistic flux rarely paralleled in the early modern era, and it was Donatello and his peers who, as I've suggested today, gave it that heady charge. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third and final speaker for this session is Adrian Randolph, who is Leon E. Williams Professor of Art History and Associate Dean of the Arts and Humanities at Dartmouth College, where he has taught since 1995. He has written 2 books, co-authored another, and edited 2 collections of essays. Among these publications, I'd like to highlight his most recent book, published by Yale University Press at the end of last year, entitled Touching Objects, Intimate Experiences of Italian Renaissance Art. This is a new book, so I haven't finished it, but what I've read is wonderful. Professor Randolph's essays focus on a remarkable variety of objects, paintings and sculptures of all types, also courtship boxes, marriage chests, cassoni, deschi, birth trays. The range of themes he has investigated in his publications is just as broad. To mention a few: sculpture in space, gender, the gaze, politics, and art. And of course, the interconnections among these are discussed throughout his many publications. His talk today is titled Sculpture and Violence, Abraham and Isaac by Donatello and Il Rosso. Professor Randolph, welcome.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks all the organizers. Thank you all for coming out. I feel we should go outside and make some snowmen of Hercules or lions, as the Florentines did, in another mode of sculpture making that I think we won't be talking about today. The title of this talk, Sculpture and Violence, possibly could be shifted to be Sculpture and Ethics. I've moved my ideas a little bit, but let's see how it unfolds. Of the sculpted marble prophets that were produced to ring Florence's campanile in the early 15th century, one made by Donatello and Nanni di Bartolo, we've already seen it a couple of times, stands out. And I think it stands out wonderfully upstairs in the gallery. Whereas many of the other prophets unsurprisingly embody prophecy, in that they seem poised to speak. Their clarion virtual prophecies, analogous in some ways to the clarion call of the sonorous bells above. Abraham instead seems poised to act. Yet rather than clear, vigorous intent expressed by his face and body, he appears as if caught on the horns of a dilemma, ethical, religious, personal. I wish to suggest that it is because of the tension running through this representation and the way in which it troubles conventional accounts of Renaissance sculpture that the rather extraordinary qualities of this work have been overlooked, if not ignored. As with so many works by Donatello, it's useful to consider the work as understood by, to my mind, one of the greatest of Donatello's scholars, Hans Kaufmann. Here's what Kaufmann wrote in the 1930s, capturing, I think, something essential about this work of art. And I quote, "Unlike the narrators working in relief," and he's referring here to Brunelleschi and Ghiberti, the competition reliefs, details of which you see here, the statue sculpture, that he's referring here to Donatello, did not represent the enforcement, but rather the readiness and the stopping before the act. Standing over the forsaken Isaac, Abraham looks around questioningly, in final anticipation. The back and forth of the bodies bears witness to their agony, and though so close to one another, neither one sees the other. The splitting of their gazes grips us with the hopelessness of misunderstanding. And he goes on, the opposites operate even further. One head sinks, the other rises. One head or one body is in shadow, the other is illuminated. Isaac's arms are hidden. Those of Abraham anticipate powerfully in a double twist. Isaac slumps in silence while Abraham is on the cusp of crying out. So in Kaufmann's analysis, Abraham's hands in the middle of the composition are the Wendepunkt, the turning point or the hinge on which the psychic and psychical and physical drama turns. The German scholar succinctly offers key observations. The compositional polarity that draws the figures toward one another, like two magnets who are sort of forced together at their polar ends, proximate through enforcement, but repelling by nature. And I could not agree more about the turning point, but with one important addition. It's formed not only by the powerful, vein-riddled hands of Abraham, but also by the knife in one of them, pressed onto Isaac's right shoulder, close to his vulnerable neck. This visual tactile drama of notional metal against skin and or marble would, I imagine, have been lost even the most attentive of viewers in the piazza below. And yet, somehow this detail fascinates me, and I think if you go upstairs, it's really quite striking how important this knife on the shoulder of Isaac appears. And so much of what we see, I think, and this has come up today already a couple of times obliquely, so much of what we see in Renaissance sculpture of this period is visually soft: skin, drapery, hair, rendered in the hard media of metal and stone. Turned against themselves, these materials are made to signify something quite differently than their nature. And yet they must, at least in a religious context, retain their material meanings. For so many sculptures of this sort are not only representations, but also material gifts. For so many of the works in this period can usefully be seen as ex voto gifts to God and to his family and saints, etc., given with the expectation of some form of salvation through religious art. And the grand patronage programs that we see that yielded sculptures like this one were understood not only as ornamentation and ornamenting and beautifying civic spaces, but also as artistic down payments on post-mortem timeshares in heaven. But this sculpture, showing Abraham's willingness to sacrifice, troubles the normative cycle regarding gifts and links it to art making. Abraham is as good as a murderer, ready to sacrifice his son and his personal morality in obedience to God. In the sculpture, the compositional hinge or turning point links this ethical tension, I think, to art making. For I see in the knife something akin to a sculptural tool, notionally framing the artist as Abraham, or vice versa, and Isaac as the gift of art. The possibility of cutting into the sculpture is underpinned by the violence that softened the stone into flesh, cloth, and hair, and the turning point of the knife. In one powerful hand, Abraham grasps Isaac's flowing hair, which bunches in his fist like the ends of a rope, or perhaps, and there's the grasping of the hair of Isaac, and here's a detail of that with the knife resting on the shoulder. And it bunches in his hands a little bit. I don't know why I thought of this, but it reminds me of the rush mats in the niche for the parte guelfa that somehow is squashed notionally under the weight of the marble above. The pressure of the grip, expressed through the slightly torqued wrist and arm, as well as the veiny hand, establishes a tension between the young body twisting away, yet held back by the paternal grasp. And this play of physical and psychological forces is underscored, almost literally, by the curved blade resting on the adolescent's right shoulder, or better put, on the marble representing the youth's shoulder. Here we see no angel. There is no explicit forestalling of narrative. Also, instead of a large sword, the traditional and distancing weapon that appears in most renditions of the scene, Abraham holds a knife, an intimate weapon that requires a surgical proximity to his son's body and increases, I think, the sense of moral responsibility we attribute to the father. This is no sanitized and distance killing. This is a direct slaughter, demonstrating obedience to a needy God. Abraham looks ready for his work. He's taken the time, we must retrospectively imagine, to roll up his right sleeve in preparation for the rather bloody butchery he anticipates. And in the same vein, this arm also reminds me of a sculptor's hand, an arm, which would have also engaged in dirty work, grasping bladed metal tools to chip and scrape, cut and file, abrade and smooth. Now, to step back for a moment, before I go on to some rather philosophical musings about this sculpture, I just wanted to delve into what Florentines might have made of this iconography. Now, of course, they would have known it from the Bible, from Genesis 22, but the rather laconic biblical account would have been fleshed out in numerous other ways, through sermons, through popular retellings like those in the Golden Legend, etc., and of course in works of art, like the ones we've seen that already represent this story in various ways. But for the sake of brevity, let me turn to a distinctive retelling of the story found in a Sacra Rappresentazione from the 1440s, written by Feo Belcari, and first presented at the convent of Santa Maria Maddalena in Cestelli. What's most extraordinary about this text, which is very long and very complex and very melodramatic, is the way in which it attributes action and thought and agency to the figure of Isaac. And I'm just going to quote to you some verses from this text. "O Holy Father," and this is Isaac speaking, "how have you agreed to give such a great gift in sacrifice? For what transgression must I suffer such cruel torment with no possible forgiveness? Have mercy on my tears of innocence and on my tender years. And if you still refuse to hear my plea that you should spare me, then I'll die at once, and you 100 times." That's actually quite remarkable. Isaac says, I will die once physically, but you will die in torment emotionally. It's almost a curse upon his father, which is not, let's say, the normative way, I think, in which Isaac is thought of in this story. But after some cajoling, Isaac does come around, and he says, "It was not right that I should have been born if I were ever to defy God's will, and were I not to stand ever prepared to be obedient to you, dear Father. And I can see that your heart is quite pierced by great pain for the fact that I must die, but God who sits in heaven's empyrean will reward us for this great martyrdom." So in the end, he does come around to filial piety and sacrifices himself in sort of a chain of sacrifice and obedience. So Belcari neatly sums up the story, emphasizing key normative ethical points. Abraham fears or obeys God and is willing to sacrifice that which is most dear to him. But what's extraordinary, as I said before, is the value set on Isaac's interior struggle. Instead of only Abraham's moral tension, we see a similar mirrored tension in Isaac. Now, it would be easy and somewhat facile, I think, to see a similar emphasis in Donatello's and Nanni di Bartolo's sculpture. The turning away, the discrete anguish, seemingly suffered by both figures, as Kaufmann pointed out, turning in different directions. Isaac's resistance, signaled by Abraham's grasping of his hair. It's an important detail that Isaac seems to perhaps be resisting, therefore that grasp is necessary. But also his acquiescence in the pose of the genuflection, which seems almost to be giving himself up to this inevitable act. But I don't really want to see the sculpture as foreshadowing the ethics of Belcari's drama. They are, in fact, quite different in their emphases. Instead, by adducing the Sacra Rappresentazione, really what I want to do is to alert us to the fact that Florentines would have been alive to multiple ethical points of view and tensions available in the narrative, and by extension in the sculpture, and not only to one textual reading. Now, to understand these tensions, I'd like to take with you an excursion, hopefully one that's fruitful, into the world of philosophy. And my goal here is to raise certain themes that have, in the last century or so, really transformed interpretations of Abraham and Isaac in that intellectual sphere. And my goal here is perhaps to have us understand whether any of these resonances were alive in the 15th century, but also simply to transform our own reactions as we look at this object in the 21st century today. So I'm only going to speak about three thinkers, Kierkegaard, Levinas, and Derrida, but I'll just go through them in very brief and succinct form to give you an idea of how they have seen the figure of Abraham. Writing under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio, Søren Kierkegaard famously explored the figure of Abraham in his book Fear and Trembling, and explored the tension in the figure of Abraham, ordered by God to do something so clearly at odds with ethical norms. It demanded, thought the Danish philosopher, quote, teleological suspension of the ethical. It was only by suspending ethical norms and imagining that there was a religious end that justified that suspension that Abraham could act. But this act of suspension entailed a sort of residue of tension. A tension between the ethical on the one hand, the sort of the human legalistic norm of don't kill children, and especially your own, perhaps, but hopefully all, and then the religious, the command by God. Now, to make this utterly clear, if you just imagine in your own mind Abraham sort of brought before a court of law today and asked to explain himself for his actions, I think you could imagine that Abraham would not come off lightly out of that process. And yet, he does remain an exemplar of faith. In Kierkegaard's analysis, Abraham chooses to rise above human law and chooses the exceptional. And it's this leap that marks him as special. Yet the choice is rooted in a type of uncertainty, of fear and trembling, and the anxiety wrought through the abnegation of normative ethical responsibilities. And the story therefore encapsulates both human free will, the ability to choose the exceptional, but also the normative tracks, the religious and the ethical, within which that sort of free will unfolds. It thus constitutes a cornerstone of existential thinking, which focuses on individual choice and his or her response to norms. Now, this existentialism was questioned and transformed in the 20th century by two thinkers in relation to this story, Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida. In their ideas, more than those of others, you find a new framing of, a philosophical framing of Abraham and Isaac, and how I think, at least how I stand in relation to the Florentine sculpture at the heart of these comments. For French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, the story of Abraham and Isaac was, as it was for Kierkegaard, foundational for ethics. Abraham saw God, however, in the face of his son. And I thought I'd deduce these two objects which we're familiar with by now. Quote, "The epiphany of the face," Levinas wrote, "is ethical." Put simply, Levinas collapses Kierkegaard's tension between human choice and the angel's intervention, and the divine command, into a reading of the divine in the face of Isaac. And so the ethical tension becomes one between two individuals. The angel is in some ways totally unnecessary in this story. It's really saying that the angel is a facet of Abraham's imagination, which in some way you could say some sculptures, including the one at the center of these comments, could also suggest. In his response to Levinas, Derrida, in his book, The Gift of Death, sought to rehabilitate Kierkegaard's reading in typically nomic prose. Derrida reinstated, again typically, difference. Tout autre et tout autre is the rallying cry of this essay. Every other is completely or entirely other. Derrida sees in Abraham's choice to kill his son and his subsequent choice not to, and he makes it Abraham's choice, as descriptive of all ethical decision-making. It figures responsibility, and yet rather than simply a decontextualized decision to kill or not kill, the very notion of responsibility to this particular individual, Abraham's responsibility to his son, this other entity, is the choice. Quote, "As soon as I enter into a relation with another, with the gaze, the look, request, love, command, or call of the other, I know that I can respond only by sacrificing ethics. That is, by sacrificing whatever obliges me to also respond in the same way, in the same instant, to all others. We are ethically," end of citation, "we are ethically responsible for all relations, and yet we must choose some. In doing so, the logic of our ethical choice unravels. We choose to take one of Derrida's examples to feed one cat, our pet cat, but leave many others starving. Ethical choices undermine ethics. And in this way, Derrida subscribes to what Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical, necessary for Abraham to do what he thought was right. It also maintains the tense relation between the human ethical, our obligations to humans and possibly animals, and religion, our responsibilities and obligations to God. So I realize some of you are asking, what on earth does this all have to do with 15th century sculpture? Let me have a go. This work, the one at the center of my comments, is a gift to God, a sacrifice. It also thematizes Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son, to offer a gift to God. But whereas Abraham's gift must, in order to operate as a sacrifice, be given without any expectation of return, the gift of the sculpture is offered precisely within a normative economy in which salvation is expected. Abraham's gift, moreover, is rejected. And in this rejection, we find a moral split discussed by the philosophers, pitting human ethics against divine responsibility. The sculptors chose not to have Abraham and Isaac face one another, as did, more or less, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi in their competition panels, as you've seen a number of times. Rather than some ethical decision wrought through an immediate relation to the other, our protagonists twist apart, leaving us with the turning point, that Wendepunkt of Kaufmann's, of the hand and the knife. We are left with imminent violence, and if, as I'm proposing in a very roundabout way, I understand, this sculpture posits an ethical artistic problem, what is it? There are several odd things about this sculpture that have gone relatively unnoticed in the very little that's been written about it. Firstly, in a series of prophets, Abraham and Isaac appear not in their role as prophets. There's nothing prophetic about what we see. Instead, we are materializing an idea, simply perhaps the fact that the figure, gosh, I seem to have skipped something there. Let me just look at this. Give me a moment. Instead, we are confronted with an exceptional narrative and figural grouping. Secondly, in the history of sculpture, this life-size two-figure composition stands out, especially in a Florentine context, where in subsequent decades, one would see a sustained artistic investment in the problematic of the two-figured, multi-figured sculptural composition, a leitmotif in the sculpture of the city, and it's been referred to before. Donatello's Judith and Holofernes, to mention one, Michelangelo's Victory, much later, but also Cellini's Perseus, Hercules Caicus, and Hercules and Caicus. This notion of the two-figure, almost antagonistic figure, you could see the Abraham and Isaac at the head of this, which I don't think is conventionally how it's been treated. And thirdly, in this work, the Abraham and Isaac, we see one of the most remarkable sculptural nudes since antiquity. It is, I think, interesting and symptomatic that so much ink has been spilled in arguing about Donatello's bronze David, and I've spelt a little myself, as a watershed in the history of the nude, while the nude Isaac has basically been ignored. Naked, apparently soft-skinned, and with genitals fully visible, how could this representation of the adolescent and vulnerable male body have escaped notice? Possibly because it was for so long so far away from spectators perched high up on the campanile. But I don't think this is sufficient reason. It could also be that its dual authorship troubled analysis, not letting it conform to notions of the heroic, singular artist materializing an idea. Similarly, perhaps, the fact that the figure of Isaac is subsidiary, almost an attribute of Abraham, may have taken it out of focus. But again, I think there may be more going on here. I, as I've alluded to, see in Abraham's strong arm, bare and prepared for dirty work, a stand-in, an avatar for the working arm of the artist or artists, and the scalpel-like blade held against the kneeling marble nude as akin to the tools of the sculptor. And let me demonstrate the oddity of this by way of an example. And here's a detail from Nandi Banco's famous predella at Orsa Michele, showing the work of four sculptors, and here we see the one on the right. Now, the representational codes of realism mean that it could appear as if we see a man cruelly attacking a naked child with a sharp tool, which is what sort of the axe he has in his hands. But we realize it's not that. Both figures are represented in marble, but we understand one figure is more stony than the other. The child's body is doubly stony, for it's both stone materially but also narratively. Now, the claim made by, I think, by Donatello, or perhaps this sculpture, Donatello Neo Rosso sculpture, is far less obvious. And perhaps it only exists in my mind. I'm ready to entertain that. But if one imagines the possibility that this sculpture comments on the making of sculpture, by positing the faithful Abraham as an artist and Isaac at once stone made into flesh, but simultaneously perhaps stone representing stone, as Abraham's artistic gift to God, perhaps you can see why I think this work troubles the notion of art as ex voto. For in the narrative, Abraham's gift is rejected. The angel swoops down and tells the prophet, the seer, the one who can see the future, that it was only a test. Put another way, I wonder if in this sculptural work, one that foreshadows the multi-figure challenge that Florentine sculptures struggled again and again to solve, a sculptural work that offers a strikingly novel rendition of a young nude male body, something that would come in subsequent years to represent the emergence of art freed from religious context, and as we've heard, sort of independently stand in the figures of Donatello's Bronze David and, of course, Michelangelo's Giant David. I wonder if this work, in ways that are analogous to the philosopher's recognition of a split between Abraham's ethical responsibility to other beings and his religious responsibility to God, might represent a troubled ethical and aesthetic origin of something we might call art. No longer a prayerful gift of sacrifice to be accepted by God in exchange for salvation, it is only a test of the artist's virtuosity, something no longer active in the religious market of souls, but now also a commodity. With an aesthetic market appreciating expressivity, meaning, and skill, emblematized by the uncertainty of the knife or tool, suggesting violence, but perhaps also the work of sculpture. And if so, I'd say that our collective blindness to this work's extraordinary qualities is a symptom of our inability to address the complex ways in which religion and ethics, art and prayerful sacrifice remain intertwined and inseparable through the period known as the Renaissance and into our own day. Thank you.
I have a question perhaps for David and Adrian. A question on Donatello's, for a better way to say it, his expressionism. David, you talked about the disharmony in the perspective, and then Adrian, you were talking about the psychological tension in the Abraham group, and then moving it later in the Mary Magdalene, the harrowing quality, and then the St. John the Baptist. Was there any ferment in the day intellectually that he was doing to do this kind of raw emotional quality, or was this simply his vocabulary as an artist, do you think?
Take it away.
That's a tough question. I think that my initial reaction would be that at these early dates, it is somewhat what sets him apart. Because I work on Bologna so much, what immediately comes to mind also is Niccolò dell'Arca's Lamentation, but that's from the 1460s. So I think I would have to think more thoroughly and look back at more images to think of examples where the expressiveness can be tied to not only the subject matter that's represented, but also the intended impact on the viewer. Because that's also what Niccolò dell'Arca is doing. It's not just about expressing the emotion, it's about compelling the viewer to react in a similar way as one of the figures in the scene. So I would tentatively say that Donatello as a sculptor stands apart to a certain extent, but that's a tentative initial answer.
I think my answer is no. In the sense that I think you were asking, is there anything exceptional about the period in which he's working in that may have led to his being particularly expressive? I think it's the reason I say no is if one looks into the 14th, 13th, 12th century, one can find extraordinarily expressive objects. Perhaps not sculptures of this type. In other words, it could be that it's new in this genre, but when I think of Giotto, you think of some of the extraordinary works of the earlier century. I can't see seeing them as not expressive. So for me, it's part of a sort of a continuum, I would say. And I think especially in religious art, it's something at the heart of religion, and this sort of expressive tension. So I don't see it as a particular moment for me.
John, I think I saw your hand go first, and then
I have a question for Peter. Thanks a lot, Peter. Very interesting. Rethinking that material, which of course has to be done continually. I thought I liked your concentrating on the two statues of the 1430s, the Bronze David and the Atta San Marino. They certainly seem key pieces. And I thought that was very interesting for you to just hone in on them as like test cases for the movement towards one could, as I take it, your talk, one could really see as, okay, now we're at that moment. This is the freestanding statue. I just wanted to raise another question that you sort of touched on, whether the multi-level iconography, the levels of meaning, which still puzzle us from both those statues, certainly from the Atta San Marino. God knows what's really going on in that. Connoisseur, philosophical currents, a total can of worms. No, a total really dense and wonderful piece. Really, it's always been one of my favorites of the early Renaissance and mysterious. So my question really is the multi-levelness of these two pieces that you concentrated on, does that somehow constitute part of the story of the final emergence of the freestanding statue? Because actually, is there any Michelangelo that isn't a hopelessly multi-level kind of piece also? And so maybe it isn't just that it's in the round, but that it's in the round, that is part of the definition.
Yeah, it's a great point you're making, Deborah, and I totally agree. There's a quality about the Donatello's bronzes, these two bronzes, that focuses in on themselves, both in terms of their meaning and their formal disposition and the layers of meaning that we could go on all night about. That I think that really does lead us into, however you want to say, freestanding, the statua, the statuary. So I take that point very well. Yeah.
John's next.
I have a kind of non-response to the previous question that was asked to David and to Adrian. It seems to me one of the things that one might think about in terms of something going on at the time that may provoke this kind of emotional appearance of a kind of emotionalism in sculpture might have to do with the shift in the monastic communities in Florence, a real push toward conventional monasticism. Original monasticism as opposed to conventionalism in all of the religious orders in the city of Florence. There's also a great deal going on in the sermon history of the period, particularly once Antoninus comes along and is pushing very, very hard at a kind of reform situation. But I think the real elephant in the room has to do with the enlivened religious experience of the time through liturgical practice and through liturgical theater. I've worked a little bit, as you all know, with crucifixes that have movable arms, and they exist all the way through the 15th century. Now, that's a small subset of wooden crucifixes, which is a small subset of what we're dealing with here. On the other hand, the fact that they exist in the 15th century and that they're utilized so that on Good Friday, those crosses are taken down from the cross the arms put down, the body wailed over by people in the congregation, and then ultimately buried in the church, suggests that kind of live emotional practice attached very, very closely to sculpture of the time. And there, I heard a talk years and years ago about practice in one of the confraternities in San Marco, where a religious confraternity of males gathered together on Good Friday in their confraternity house, stripped, with a crucifix, a wooden crucifix, on the ground, and the men in the room stripped and put on monastic costume. In other words, they put on dresses, long flowing monastic costumes, so they regender themselves into females in order to wail over the dead body of Christ that is in their confraternal space. That is a very interesting aspect of the use of these forms that generates the kind of emotional, I want to say excess, but emotional practice that was behind the question I think that was asked.
I think there was 2 rows up and then Gary after that.
Can I just say something to John? I mean, the only thing running through my head is a lot of those practices were happening also in other parts of Europe in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. In other words, and I think the connection with sculpture may be the new one in Florence, and that's interesting to me. But other people had this sort of very expressive way of performing religious practices. So it's not just in Florence, just at this time.
I have a question for Peter. I want to return to your remark that there was apparently no term for freestandedness in the period, and just to suggest a possible reason for that, and that wasn't freestandedness relative to previous practice rather than absolute. I mean, I think if one could listening to your lecture, it seemed to suggest, I don't think you would if you asked explicitly, to suggest that the freestandedness, autonomy of the figure was absolute in a modern sense.
No. Yeah.
But I think perhaps you might want to qualify what you're saying, the term you're describing in that sense, that it's not the same as a modern, the freestanding independence, the true independence of a modern sculpture, which is made for anywhere, often made for anywhere and nowhere. And possibly that only occurs in small bronzes. And they're made for a different kind of space, which is not real space, but it's virtual space, the space of the marketplace. That's when true kind of more absolute kind of freestandedness occurs. I don't know if this makes this is useful to you, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. Thank you, Marvin. The small bronzes were my point of departure. So in a way, I'm not really doing justice to the concepts that I'm speaking of. I think a lot that relativity of the term or of the concept, you can start to get at it a little better in greater depth by looking, as some other scholars have done, at the etymology of statuette. Well, rather the depth of the word as it's used throughout the Middle Ages, and then what happens in the 15th century. But yeah, I think the thing that I honed in on in all of this is that movement of these large, of monumental feeling sculptures into the private or semi-public space is that's a turning point. And from my point of view, ultimately it does lead to the statuette. But
these new sculptures are brought out of niches, let's say, being closely confined by the architecture into a more open space. Yet it's not a liberated space. It's an architectural, very specific space. They're all meant for very specific spaces, aren't they?
Well, I think that the Amoratis and the David are meant, while of course their owners and the people who commissioned them had something, a space in mind. I think the fact that what little we do know about the sprite, it moved often in the 15th century in a way that is similar to the way that the David moved twice in the 15th century. And I mean, I know that this does happen with the sculptures that we have upstairs right now. I think there's something different going on. But I take your point very well.
Yeah, they move from one specific space to another specific space. They're recontextualized spatially and ideologically and in terms of
Yeah.
our private experience.
Too bad we don't
They're
have
never just cast free into kind of, I don't know, kind of a space that has no particular parameters of meaning or visibility or whatever.
It's a good point. Thank you.
Gary was next.
My question is exactly the same point, so I don't want to belabor it, but it has to do with, you do such a good job of telling us that freestanding is not a term that's appropriate and used in that period, and I think that that's your real contribution here is, let's find another way to talk about these things. They're not independent ever, they're always attached to some kind of base, they're always in some kind of architectural form. I guess it's just almost a suggestion that we can find a way to find a better term of ourselves, that it enriches the word stop to yet we don't seem to have enough to hold on to, and we just say that in English, that you're really on the right path.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question goes back to the issue of art and experience. So I guess it's for Adrian. And looking at your images of the sacrifice of Isaac, I couldn't help thinking about recent images we've seen about the sacrifice of kneeling hostages in Syria. And so I was wondering how common capital punishment was in early 15th century Florence, and what form did it take?
I'd have to dig back to find out how common it was. It certainly happened. There was a place in Florence out toward where the archives are now. I can't remember exactly. Someone around here knows better than I do, where they used to perform executions. Usually, I would say sacrificing, beheading, etc. was, in the Bargello and places like that was reserved for people of high status. I think you hear of hangings, you hear of various other forms of killing. Anyway, I mean, decapitation. I'm seeing signs. So yes, I mean, so people were killed, absolutely, under the law. And so that would be another way to approach looking at sculptures like this, or killing in general, when it comes to what is the power of showing someone being killed or about to be killed, and whether that has resonance with social practices of sort of state-sanctioned killing, and whether any of the same tensions I was referring to might show up in discourses about capital punishment. I don't know that. I'd have to look further. But it's fascinating, yeah. And I agree with you. Partly, yes. I mean, the initial title for this, Sculpture and Violence, came out of not necessarily about Syria, but about violence in contemporary representations. There's a lot of writing about sort of what the power of that is and what are the ethics, honestly, of showing that as well.
John, you had your hand raised, and then after that.
Well, there is the standard mode of execution in Florence during this time is defenestration, either by a rope around the neck or a rope around the leg. Either way, the person dies of asphyxiation. So there's that. The tearing apart of the bodies as part of executions of this time seems, at least in what I've looked at, to be relatively limited to crimes against the state. So at the time of the Pazzi conspiracy, there is just blood all over the streets because the conspirators are really rent, pulled apart, dragged through the streets until there's nothing left on the bones. But the notion of beheading, there may be beheadings, there are beheadings, but the tree of execution, the gallows are outside the Santa Croce gate. And they are actually on the maps of the period, so you can see.
I differ slightly with calling the sacrifice of Isaac an execution. It is a sacrifice, and the mystery play that you discussed in your talk was apt because, and also timely, that is within its own time. Because Isaac's questioning foreshadows Christ's own agony when he is called upon by his own father to sacrifice himself. It's a typological lesson and deeply felt by Donatello, because as you showed so beautifully, one goes from Brunelleschi showing the fear of Isaac, Alberti showing the sacrifice, the physical sacrifice, the face-to-face sacrifice, and Donatello showing the emotional anguish that is involved. And that is the dilemma. And I think that Abraham, in Donatello's interpretation, is not ready to kill his son. The knife is pointed away from his neck, the blade side. The hand rests on the shoulder. And Isaac, in a Christ-like gesture, is offering his neck to the knife. And there it stays. So that, I mean, that's, I think, a very traditional interpretation of what we see. But I think, you know, should be sort of reminded of. We should be reminded of it at this point.
Two things come to mind. I agree with you. I don't think it is an execution. I think the question was about whether in the context of executions, the representation of violence has any different traction. I think that's how I took the thing. But I agree that it's not representing execution per se. What you say, I think, is very true about Isaac giving himself up. I'm still struck by the grasping of the hair. In other words, I would prefer to see it, and maybe this is just my own reading, and I'm willing to say it's just subjective, as if there is an acquiescence, but also a slight tug. And I think that tension is a little distinctive. And you can see it in the other artists as well. I don't want to flatten out Ghiberti and Brunelleschi and say they just have unidimensional representations, not at all. But in this one, I think what Kaufman, the scholar, sort of got was that twisting away, and the tension is quite distinctive. And that's what I'm dwelling on, put it that way. But thank you, I agree with you.
Oh, thank you. I absolutely agree that we have to think of this as a sacrifice, and we are imposed upon us because in the story also, the ram is substituted, the lamb, right, is substituted for the human sacrifice. And I have to say that although I completely concur with your idea of looking at the transformed meaning of a story over time and how it's used for the concerns, after all, it's the concerns of the present that guide interpretations, right? And that we're always trying to get back to another world. But even so, you said you were struck by pulling the hair, but if you look more closely, he's not pulling it. The boy's hair is long, and very tenderly, he's lifting the hair off the neck in a very tender gesture, to say nothing of the fact that, as Denise very properly pointed out, the one thing you cannot do with that knife is perform the act, that the sacrifice does tender himself willingly. And I think if you think into, yes, Abraham is a prophet, giving the son prefigures and embodies that God the Father gives his own son. And when you speak about fatherhood again, it's in body language. I'm sorry I couldn't be here this morning, but perhaps things like this have already been said, that the younger figure proceeding from the loins, literally, and the hand of the older person on the shoulder of the younger represent known gestures from very far in depth to the present day. And I think the spooky, interesting thing is that the initial trial panels were also the sacrifice of Abraham. And as a number of people have said, they really are completely opposed to each other in terms of what the child is feeling. In one case, he acquiesces, he is the lamb, the sacrificial lamb. The other, he is fighting against it with everything that he can do. Now, I wonder altogether if we think of Abraham not as somebody in a moral quandary of the kind that you were speaking about, but it's really much simpler than that. The transcendent value is that Abraham will obey. He will be totally obedient, no matter what. I mean, you were speaking about that. It isn't that they're different. He's not worried about it. It's obvious, no matter if the orders are contradictory, it doesn't matter. The main thing is obedience and to obey. Therefore, I rather think that the dialogue of Abraham and Isaac images, which are very strong, very important, in a time when, let's remind ourselves, the concilia movement, and the possible role of a council in Florence and so on. I think that maybe there's a kind of undertone of the question of obedience to authority. What does obedience mean, personally, but on the level of the church, level of the state?
I'll just say thank you very much. I think it's a very sensitive reading of the sculpture. I may see it slightly as more tension-filled than you in terms of the hair. I mean, but I'll look at it again and take your comments into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to address some of the same points. Certainly, in traditional theology, Isaac is a figure of Christ. This is brought out by the fathers, who insist that just as Isaac, according to Genesis, carries the wood, which Donatello shows us very clearly, for his sacrifice up to Mount Moriah, so Christ would carry the wood of the cross to Calvary. And the origin of that patristic parallelism is really New Testament, because St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, at one point speaks of God who refused the sacrifice of Abraham's son, but wanted the sacrifice of his own. And that's an absolutely standard theological topos that you find frequently represented in art of the 14th and 15th century, especially in the bringing into scenes of the Passion images of the sacrifice of Isaac. So I would say that at one point of departure for historical reading really has to be the well-known historical topos of Isaac as figure of Christ. In the introductory essay in the catalog, I do read the work in those terms, and as has just been pointed out, I also see Abraham's left hand as pulling the boy's hair back to bare the nape of his neck to plant the blow. What I think Donatello has done is to try to capture the split second in which Abraham learns that he doesn't have to do this. So while the left hand remains tensed on the boy's hair, the right hand with the knife begins to slide away. That's not the position in which you do more than cut the boy's shoulder. That's not how you really slice his neck. The right hand is sliding away. And I read Abraham's raised face as an expression of wonder and gratitude, which, of course, in Genesis is not expressed. Genesis doesn't tell us how Abraham felt about this. It does tell us how God felt. God's response, when he sees that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, is one of wonderment and practically a kind of gratitude, because he says, because you were willing to do this, because you were willing to sacrifice your only son, I will bless you above all other nations and make your descendants as numerous, and so on and so on. And I think what Donatello has done is to read God's reaction reflected in Abraham's face. The position of the statue on the east side of the bell tower, in the next to last niche as you approach the cathedral, means that Abraham's gaze in this work carved in the very first years of Brunelleschi's work on the dome is toward the future dome. The ram, who is also missing, who will be the substitute sacrifice, and who of course in traditional theology is confused with the lamb, who is Christ, is the one who is then offered at the altar beneath the dome, and so on. I think the gaze toward the dome is part of a reading of the significance of the work within the context of the entire cathedral complex that really focuses on what will be the dominant element of the cathedral itself.
I just want to say about spatial interpretation, I think that's very convincing and interesting. I think and I couldn't agree more with the Christological. It's just the Christological is, let's say, said about every representation of Isaac and Abraham. And although that's interesting to me, I was trying to find some language for speaking about this sculpture which separated from other representations. I don't mean to diminish the idea that it's Christological in any way. I mean, that's absolutely running through it, and I think you're right, probably for a truly historical account of the sculpture, one should note that and move on. But that runs through all of the other representations as well. I'm trying to think, is it distinctively a relationship between God and Christ? And I think you alluded to some ways in which perhaps it is, and that I'll certainly think about.
I was very interested in what you said, because you did open in a very lively way the human question, Kierkegaard and Levinas and so on, of this inner conflict, which we have to assume was present in Abraham. Origen, in one of his sermons, imagines Abraham's human reaction, and taking the words from Genesis, where Isaac, as they climbed the hill after having left the servants midway up, and so Isaac is carrying the wood and the little pail of fire for the Holocaust, says to Abraham, "Father, here is the wood, here is the fire, but where is the animal?" And Origen focuses on the first word. He says, "Father." What did this mean to Abraham to hear that word in that moment? So clearly they were conscious of this also. And the thing that I really want to add is obviously the reflection that the subject is very interesting to Florentines in the early 15th century, because we have so many important representations of it. And an element of possible evidence occurs in a wonderful text of Gianozzo Manetti, where he talks about his own grief at the loss of his 4-year-old son Antonino, and how in the aftermath of the child's death, he's withdrawn to his villa in the country, and his grief takes the form of a sense of profound guilt that he is suffering so much in the face of something that he says must be the will of God. And he can't explain this to himself, that he's suffering so much. And what happens, what he recounts in the dialogue, is that he gets a messenger from friends who have gone to the Certosa di Galuzzo, and they say, "Come and join us here." And so he goes and joins his friends at the Certosa, and as he goes in, he hears the monks singing, because it is Good Friday. And so they talk about his problem with him, and they finally call the prior of the monastery, who explains that even St. Augustine wept for his dead illegitimate son, and that we're not made of stone, and so on and so on. But the question of the dilemma, what is the value of human feeling against the will of God, is part of this story. And what I see is gratitude written on the face of Abraham for the release that he's received, for not having to kill the son, so the right hand slides away, really is a fundamental perception that God does not want these kinds of sacrifices. But we know that it's the sort of question that they did labor with. There.
I'm fascinated implicitly in light of the current events that are happening in Syria with ISIS and everything, but concerning beheading, it doesn't seem logical to me, the lifting of the hair and the implication that beheading is going to be on the back of the neck. That doesn't seem logical to me. It seems that it would be from the front. And I only came to that view because of what she said about Syria. It doesn't seem right to me.
I mean, well, first of all, it's a representation which is somewhat emblematic rather than narrative, although Pace, it is narrative in certain ways. So I don't want to claim that there is some natural configuration where we can imagine the next cell in an animation where we will see it happen. That's a very different way of thinking, I think, about narrative in the period. But I agree with you, if we are going to talk about sacrifice, and if I imagine, and again, if there are other people who have any difference, I imagine the thought would be that this would be a cutting of the throat, not a beheading in the sense of a chop from above. I don't know if that's even, we should be talking about this with the sculpture, because I don't know if it is amenable to those terms, but I think that's what I have in my mind's eye if I unfortunately take the next step in the narrative. And I think the rolled up arm, the bared arm, sort of speaks of even if there are moments in the sculpture where there's a relaxation, I think to spectators it's multi-temporal. In other words, you look at certain things and have one feeling about it. I don't believe it's a moment in the narrative, and then maybe we might differ a little bit about, is this a representation of a denouement of some sort, where something is released and something's there? I'm not sure. When I look at sculptures, I often see multiple not temporality, just times. And I think when I look at the arm, I'm thinking maybe he's about to kill. But when I look at the knife, I may feel differently. When I look at the face, there may be something else going on. When I look at Isaac's face, I'm still caught in the notion he's going to be killed. So I'm not looking for that one moment in this particular sculpture. Maybe there are others where I do, but in this one not.